Okay, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Will and for all the work that he did, as well as everyone else in the Tolkien Society, to create the first event to focus on diversity and to deal with those who oppose and wish to cancel any discussion of alterity and diversity in Tolkien studies. One accusation that was made about the 16 amazing presenters is that we are projecting ourselves on Tolkien or his work and ignoring his intent. My paper is based on the idea that all readers project ourselves as we read, although I would say that all readers read through the lenses of our personal experiences, and our interpretations are shaped by that. Since, as others have noted, Tolkien is on record as, quote, preferring history with its applicability to the thought and experience of readers over allegory, because applicability resides in the freedom of the reader, I think his intent was that readers should have freedom to apply our thoughts and experiences to his story. This presentation is part of a larger project, which I began in 2018. My question then was how fans of J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, who are atheists, agnostics, animists, or part of other New Age spiritual movements, might interpret his work, especially in the context of the religious political conflicts of the second decade of the 21st century. Today, I'm talking just about how the queer atheists, agnostics, and animists who responded to my survey, ages 18 to 64, engage with Tolkien's Legendarium. So I plan to speak for only about 15 minutes to have time for questions. The handout I sent Will has information about my project, the results of my analysis, and key quotes from my online survey. I am not going to read the quotes. Instead, I will summarize my analysis and allow you to read and think about what my respondents said at your leisure. And of course, I am always happy to talk more about it with people by email. Number one, Fleegers, but what did he really mean? The first item on your handout is a 2-paragraph excerpt from an essay by Berlin Flieger that I consider to be the single best essay on the topic of Tolkien and religion that has been published so far. She argues that Tolkien's own contradictory statements in his fiction, nonfiction, and letters created the opportunity for oppositional readings about Tolkien and religion to flourish, with both Christian and neo-pagan fans claiming the work and the author as a messenger for their beliefs. She reminds us, however, that The Lord of the Rings is, quote, a book from which readers have been taking what they want and need for 60 years, and that they show no sign of stopping, end of quote. I believe her argument extends to how readers engage with all of Tolkien's Legendarium, and in this project, bring what actual readers take, want, and need from his work related in their own accounts. So what was this survey? The second item on your handout describes my survey and research process. It was reviewed and approved by the Texas A&M Commerce University's Institutional Review Board, which functions to protect the rights of human subjects in research. I collected 112 completed surveys. But for today's talk, I am focusing on the responses from the 38 people, 34%, who identify themselves as variously asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, or queer. But what do I really mean by queer? The third item on your handout is a quote from Alexander Doty's film monograph, Flaming Classics, Queering the Film Canon, where he lists 6 different definitions of queer or queerness that he has found in queer theory and scholarship. The definition that best fits the work I'm doing in this presentation is 2A, an umbrella term to pull together lesbian and or gay and or bisexual with little or no attention to differences, similar to certain uses of gay to mean lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transsexuals, and transgendered people. As table number 1 shows, about 70% of my respondents are bisexual and or pansexual, with the remaining 30% being asexual, gay, lesbian, or queer. The fourth item on your handout summarizes the demographic information. Table 2 shows that the 38 respondents ranged in age from 18 to 64 years, with the majority of them, 60%, being in their 20s or 30s. Table 3 covers gender. 60% are women, with the remaining 40% being agender, male, or non-binary. These tables were relatively straightforward to pull together. Things became much more complicated with the political identification because, of course, what is considered conservative, centrist, liberal not only differs from country to country, sometimes within regions of the same country, it also changes over time. So for now, I simply grouped the responses for nationality, ethnicity, and political identity into one table, number 4. Generally, 58% of the respondents are American, with the remaining 42% coming from a number of other countries. The vast majority are white, perhaps because of flaws in my research process, perhaps because of Black, Indigenous, and people of color's well-founded distrust of white academics' data gathering, or possibly those as well as other factors. I'm needing to do research in political science for what the political labels and terminology actually mean, but although Doty argues that none of the definitions of queer allow the assumption of a radical, progressive, or even liberal position on gender, sexuality, or other issues, it's true that the majority on almost all of these respondents identify as being left of centrist in various ways. But I did not assume that they would all identify as progressive, nor did I put any restrictions for participating in the survey beyond that of being an adult. The 5th item on your handout is an overview of my analysis of the responses to my 8 open-ended questions, which is where things get complex and fascinating. I generated the categories in the table by a rhetorical analysis of what the responders said. I read and reread responses, identifying keywords and phrases, and using those to group similar responses together. This process is ongoing. While working on this paper, I found a category I'd not seen in a previous analysis. Please note that all the quotes from my respondents are reproduced exactly as they typed them into the survey. I did no editing. So, table number 5 covers the responses to the first 2 questions, how they identify and what their beliefs are. I'm organizing this alphabetically and have supplied selected comments for each group below the headers. About 30% of the group are agnostics, another 30% are atheists, while the remaining respondents are animists or belong to a variety of other spiritual groups and movements. Their comments about what these specific categories of identity mean to them in terms of their beliefs or lack of belief show a range of definitions about what the term means for different people. The most complicated one is atheist, and there could be a whole bunch more on all those different terms. As someone who is currently an atheist, who was a lukewarm Presbyterian as a child and became a Wiccan neo-pagan in college, and is now also something of an atheist and an animist, I wanted to know about people's experiences with organized religion. Table 6 shows that 40% had negative experiences with a variety of denominations and groups, but that the remaining 60% had either neutral or limited experiences, 32%, or positive ones, or a mix of both positive and negative. The last category here is one that showed up early in my analysis of the open-ended responses. It's complicated and needs more work, meaning I need to work on it more. I wanted to know how old they were when they first read Tolkien, or as it turns out, were read Tolkien by a parent, and what their favorite Tolkien works are. All Tolkien fans I know have and love to share their origin stories and talk about their favorites. Table 7 shows that half were 8 to 12 years old at the time, all reading on their own. A quarter were 4 to 7 years old. This is where some were read to first by a parent, and the remaining quarter were in their teens, with the oldest reported reading age being 20. While I only asked what age they were, a number took advantage of my open-ended question format to share details about their first reading as well as later ones. Table 8 covers their favorites of Tolkien's work, most listed 2, with some going as high as 8 or 9, which makes coding and counting the results a challenge. At this stage, I'm only identifying the first, second, and third items from responses, I've given individual texts a number to use for tracking, and I realized I need to expand that because while the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings are sort of in competition for the top spot, some responses identify a specific chapter from the Silmarillion, others a specific volume of the trilogy. The responses to the 6th and 7th questions are, of course, the most interesting to me, and I cannot even begin to do them justice today, but we can talk during the Q&A and in the Q&A chat. I provided a number of responses that I selected to show the variety of responses to the questions. Table 9 covers my analysis of responses to what makes Tolkien's work important to you. I've identified 3 broad categories of things. The first one is genre, which includes responses that focus on structural or literary elements of Tolkien's work, plots, character, themes, and/or his importance to the genre of fantasy. Half of the respondents focused on genre as making his work important to them. The 2 other categories are based on some sort of personal connection. These are responses that are written more in first-person language rather than listing the structural elements and explaining how reading Tolkien made their lives better in some way. A quarter of the respondents are grouped under this basic personal connection, and those range from explaining how Tolkien helped them deal with their lives while adolescent to influencing their choices of profession as adults. A third group, about 10%, are gathered under change over time because they describe personal connections that are lifelong and often changing because how Tolkien's work changes for them every time they read it. Another 10% identify both genre and some sort of personal connection. Table 10 covers the complex range of responses to the question about how respondents think or feel about the widespread, in my experience at least, assumption that Tolkien's religion must be part of any interpretation. In my analysis of the 112 surveys from my previous presentations, I have already identified 8 different types of responses. Working with the 38 for this presentation, I think I've discovered a 9th one. So the types of responses are, first, people who reject the assumption entirely with varying degrees of intensity. 18% of them fall into this category. Second, people who accept that the assumption can be useful or valid when reading Tolkien, but disagree that it is required or necessary, and who also tend to reject it for themselves, another 18%. Third, people who accept the assumption as useful for academics working on Tolkien, but not important for general readers. This is a separate category because the responses focus on hypothetical groups of readers who presumably read for different purposes. Analysis is split off from pleasure. The respondents don't personally reject the idea of the importance of the assumption. Only one person in my group thinks this, although the larger number of surveys have more people thinking this way. Fourth, people who agree to some extent with or see some merit in the assumption, often specifying the usefulness for the Silmarillion. Another 1% or 2% is in that category. Fifth, people who said that they accept Tolkien's religious beliefs as important to understanding his work, but do not think they are any more or less important than any other biographical information. This category is, again, a separate one because the position is that any and all information about the author can be equally useful. It's a biographical approach, not that his religious beliefs must be privileged or isolated in ways that other personal information is not. 16% of this group of respondents fell into this category. Sixth, people who respond with some variant of "the author is dead," often quoting that phrase in their response. They accept that Tolkien's religion affected his story, but emphasize equally the importance of the reader's personal worldview, whether their own or readers in general, in interpreting the story, which is what makes this its own category. 21% of the respondents are in this group. Seventh, a number of respondents said they never saw religion in Tolkien's work, or they only learned about his religion late in their own lives, or they had never heard this assumption from Tolkien readers. 7% of the respondents are in this group. The 8th one is my current category. I'm currently calling it depends on definition, and it's complicated. These responses tend to be longer than all the rest, more dialogic, and often cite a great deal of specific evidence from Tolkien's work. A number of these people contrast his work to Lewis's more allegorical fantasy, or they go into great detail describing interactions with Tolkien readers. 10% of the responses fit here. While working through this specific group of responses, I realized that there was perhaps a subset of this 8th category that might become a 9th. These are people who describe that they had very negative responses. They judge those readers who insist on what I'm calling the Christian allegorical reading. By that, I mean readers insisting that the Christian message is the only correct one, the only one true to Tolkien's intent, thus allegorical, as opposed to what I believe are the majority of readers who see Christian themes in the work, but who do not attempt to gatekeep or exclude others. 6% of the respondents took this stance. The 8th question I had was an optional one, simply asking if they had anything else they wanted to say about Tolkien's work. I've not done much work with this responses yet because of the time I spent with the others, but I've included them on the handout. My conclusion is that the stories people tell about reading Tolkien's work are powerful ones. I believe my project, featuring the voices and stories of Tolkien readers whose beliefs and experiences have previously been invisible or suppressed in scholarship or some fandom spaces, has the potential to show how much is shared across the spectrum of religious and non-religious beliefs. In terms of future work, I realized as I was completing this presentation that I will really need to write a book rather than an essay or two to start to convey all of I have learned. So that will be one of my future projects. Thank you.
That was sensational. Thank you very much, Robin. And I'm sure as well, all of the everyone that you have interviewed and got data for, I'm sure they would like to thank you as well for being their voice for them today as well. I think so. Someone posted in the chat, you've exploded their brain with the amount of data that you have provided as well. But at the same time, it's what one of the points of the seminar as well is hearing those voices perhaps that we've not heard so much before as well. So it's impressive to see the impact that this can have when we do listen. So thank you very much. Now,
my students used to call me the queen of the handouts, but I didn't want to just give numbers. I wanted to share the voices. So
yeah, exactly. That's the powerful element. I apologies if anyone can hear seagulls. Apparently there's, I don't know, there might be like a fight club happening outside with seagulls. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so Robin, let's dive straight in to the questions. So remember, if you've got any questions for Robin, please do post them in the chat, not in the chat, the Q&A. Okay, Robin. Okay, so this question, they missed the very beginning. So if you have covered this, then please feel free that we can move on. But the questioner was curious what led you to focus specifically on queer respondents as opposed to cis/het individuals. How do you think the queer identities of readers specifically affects their relationships with Tolkien?
Okay, well, the full survey project is the 112 is everybody who wants to talk about it. But working through 112 surveys, especially with the open-ended responses, where many people typed hundreds and at one person's thousands of words, is impossible. So what I've been doing to analyze the data is break it up into smaller chunks. Before I've looked at like either all the atheist respondents or the agnostic responses. For this one, it's a sort of complicated. Actually, I proposed a version of this for the 2019 Tolkien conference, which was rejected. And so when the diversity theme came up this year, in part because I have been working on the queer anthology that Chris Vaccaro and Steve and I are editing, I thought, why don't I pull out all the queer respondents and look at what they're saying? For one thing, the fact that 34% of them, of the respondents, identified as queer in some way, I thought larger than the general population. But at this point, I'm not sure that there is any difference between how the queer versus the straight people would. I'll have to compare the data in terms of, if anything, perhaps it might be slightly higher negative responses with organized religion, but that's just my guess now. So what I've been doing with all the presentations is trying to work out a way to get into this. Working with this group suddenly made me realize how I could set the book up, which now I need to write. So that's all it's in process.
I think one thing that we've been able to very clearly identify from this seminar is that it's a breeding ground for new ideas, and for papers and now books as well. Yeah. So I think yesterday that 3 speakers recommended our audience members to go out and research and write their own papers. So Robin, we're now holding you to this. We're looking forward to your book. Okay. Okay, so you've just obviously commented that you wanted to specifically pick out the queer responses. So it'll be interesting to perhaps see if you have a broader response to the question. How do the non-queer responses compare to the queer ones? So can you find a correlation with the frequency of certain answer categories with the reported sexual identity?
That is a very good question. Could also be asked in terms of, I mean, a large percentage of my respondents are women. First, let me say I'm a humanities person who is not trained in any way in statistics. I know that correlation and causation are different, but that's about it. And with only 112 completed surveys, I don't think this N is large enough to make any real authoritative statements about differences based on any of my categories. I collected very basic demographic information. So this is very much sort of an ethnographic and rhetorically based thing. I do the counting, and I will sort of have those comparative views. At this point, I've compared sort of agnostics versus atheists because they're such a big group. I've tried a little bit to poke around with men and women, but honestly, none of the attempts to sort of compare based on the demographics has shown me any major difference. And of course, if I ever manage to work with someone and we get approval, I would eventually like to rerun this open to everybody, including any religious, philosophical belief, and all of that. Although trying to do that larger scale is rather intimidating. So at this point, I'm not seeing anything, and will never be able to generate any sort of statistically reliable argument, if that makes sense.
I think as well, considering how wide the fandom is as well, the scale of those responses, I'm sure you would need a team to support you.
And at that point, you probably have to rely on some statistical methods.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Right, question number 3. Okay, how might your diverse and nuanced findings in this particular project push back against some of the narratives we have seen propagated recently about non-Catholic or traditional readings of Tolkien being disrespectful and unintelligent?
Well, actually, that's at the heart of the project, because although we've seen obviously a recent explosion of these sort of attacks, my experience as an out atheist queer woman who just recently escaped from 27 years living in Texas, rural Texas, is that these attacks generally in the US, I can't speak for any other countries, although I'm very glad for the sort of global range that was achieved in the survey. It's spread out. These attacks on atheists, on queer people have been longstanding in the US. And although we made some changes after the 70s, there's been such a backlash. So, and what I would hope is in my conclusion, when I do all of this analysis and look at all the things that people say they love about Tolkien out of this, nothing sounds that different to what I hear in any sort of general fandom space or from any academic presentation. So it just may be something along the lines of, gee, we can share this love of this author's work. And we atheists and queers are not destroying. So, and I sort of saw a comment. I'll note that, I mean, these attacks do exist, they're real. But when I presented this I was at the New York Tolkien Society and Pop Culture, a number of people who are Christian or interested in those themes in Tolkien have come up to talk about, again, the similarities they see with what my respondents say. And I'm hoping eventually to do some collaborative work.
Yeah, yeah, but fingers crossed we can have that as well. Okay, so I think this is going to be the last question before we have to move on. Now, this question, the question says, to be clear, they're talking about how Tolkien depicts spirituality without worship. So just a kind of a header for this question. Do you feel that part of the accessibility and applicability of Tolkien's work to non-religious or non-monotheist readers can be partly attributed to Tolkien's hesitancy to depict direct religiosity or beliefs and actions directly linked to Christianity, especially in his published works, such as The Lord of the Rings? In particular, the questioner is thinking about how Tolkien avoids identifying activities as worship, especially in a Christian context, accepting the actions of men who worship Melkor or Sauron. He explicitly states Númenóreans had no temple until they worshipped Melkor.
I would agree with that. I think that's a very good observation. And I mean, when I first read Lord of the Rings at 10 and read Tolkien's quote on allegory, it suddenly made me realize why I was starting to feel uncomfortable with the Narnia allegorical elements. And I know that's complicated and there's fascinating scholarship on it. I was struck by how many of my respondents compared Tolkien's work to Lewis's, with being less sort of pushing that at you. So yes, I think there is. I think there's also an element that the work that Tolkien so loved, his medievalist world, the northern elements, the pagan world, that the texts of those times, and I'm not a medievalist, but I talk to medievalists, they reflected a syncretism of pagan and the Christian beliefs of that historical period. So that's why neo-pagans and some of us who are pagans and Wiccans adore Tolkien, because we see the pagan elements in it. And he did not obviously distrust or dislike them, although there is that one, you know, what, Pagan Kings or something with Denethor's self-immolation. But so it's, and I know the Tolkien and the pagan seminar got some pushback as well. But yes, I think how he wrote is obviously affecting readers in ways that are, I think we need more work on why. Yes, heathen kings of old, thank you. That we need more work like what Sonali is doing, and I know Dawn is doing. We need more work on the people who read and love Tolkien.